Got Audrey Haynes, Joe Watson, Lisa Bear, all here in attendance, which is great. Also, Kaylin Stooksbury for not only helping to coordinate and plan this event, but also run tech because clearly I wasn't doing it right. And this afternoon's event is made possible through funding from the Russell Endowment. So we'd like to thank the Richard B. Russell Foundation for providing that. And I know we've got at least one member of the foundation here, so thank you. So our guest this afternoon is Greg Bluestein, a native of Sandy Springs. Greg is currently senior political reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he contributes to the Political Insider blog, the Jolt newsletter. He's the host of Politically Georgia podcast and recurring guest on GPB's Political Rewind with Bill Nigett, as well as an MSNBC and NBC news contributor. And he's definitely the busiest person I know.
We wear a lot of hats.
Yeah, lots of hats in the newspaper business these days. And last but not least, he is author of the acclaimed book, Flipped, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Republican Monopoly, or the Monopoly on Republican Power, which we'll be discussing today. 2004 graduate of the University of Georgia. Please welcome me and joining back, Mr. Greg Bluestein.
Thank you. This is the coolest feeling coming back here, and I won't be able to wipe the smile off my face all weekend. I hope.
Right. Well,
depending on what happens tomorrow.
Well, yeah. First things first. Who do you like in the game tomorrow?
Yeah. Was Georgia by 55?
I think the current spread is 54.
Oh, I was guessing. Wow.
But you've got another job.
Yeah.
You can be we've got was it Jimmy the Greek over here?
Yeah.
All right. So I'd like to begin. I've got some prepared questions, and then I think towards the top of the hour, we'll throw it open to the audience for questions about the book, about the elections, about Greg's life, career prospects, all that good stuff. So last time I looked, you and I sat down to talk was December 2018.
Mm-hmm.
How have things been since then?
A little busier. I mean, when we talked in December 2018, can everyone hear? Okay. Okay, good. When we talked in December 2018, Georgia had just become more of a battleground state. I probably talked about how in 2016 at the AJC, I was everywhere but Georgia. I was in Nevada and Ohio and New Hampshire and everywhere, South Carolina, covering the national political campaign because there really wasn't as much to cover in Georgia. In 2016, the big race was Johnny Isakson versus someone who I doubt many people in this room can name, but Jim Barksdale was the Democratic candidate nominee for that office. And it was an afterthought. And Isakson, of course, easily won re-election. And then in 2017, things started changing with John Ossoff's run and Donald Trump's election in November, and the suburbs of Metro Atlanta flipping decisively. That still is a dominant theme in our upcoming November elections. But it was John Ossoff's run, the special election run in the 6th district, which then it's different now. I used to live in the 6th district, but back then it stretched from East Cobb all the way to North DeKalb. And it was a +21 district for Tom Price, who was the incumbent at the time, but Trump only won it by 1.5 points. And that sort of was a foretelling, I guess, of the problems that Republicans would have in the Metro Atlanta suburbs. And that's what contributed to the beginning of this political change that we're still undergoing in Georgia.
So before we jump into the book, you came to us right off the campaign trail. What's the news? What's tomorrow's headlines today?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. This morning, I watched Sonny Perdue's investiture, which I know is near and dear to the folks here at UGA. I was with Stacey Abrams as she was talking about the Atlanta Medical Center's closing, and I was with Herschel Walker and Nikki Haley up in, where was it, Norcross. So it was almost on the way here. So already a busy day. The biggest headline, and frankly, one of the biggest stories in Georgia, which I hope that everyone here is tuned into, is the closing of Atlanta Medical Center, the abrupt closing in November that caught a lot of people, including city and congressional leaders, off guard. This is the only other level 1 trauma center in the city of Atlanta, and it's going to be a tremendous strain on the rest of the city's very fragile healthcare network. We've been covering a lot. It's one of those stories where you feel like it's just going to become even bigger and bigger because, frankly, because people are going to suffer with this big medical center closing. And so one of our stories for tomorrow and already today is that the state is state and local officials are looking at some sort of rescue aid package, not for Atlanta Medical Center, that's closing, but for Grady, because now a lot of their patients end up going to Grady. That's one of the stories. And then the other one is that Georgia is already becoming a stomping ground for 2024 candidates. Nikki Haley's visit reinforced that, but we've had Mike Pence come to town recently. This is all in the last few months. Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump could yet come back here, so stay tuned in October. And a number of other, Ted Cruz was here just a few weeks ago. So we're already sort of this test case for 2024 as candidates realize how important Georgia is going to continue to be in the next election cycle.
So before we jump into the book, I saw you shared this on social media, and Professor Bullock, who was supposed to be sitting in this chair but had other engagements, so you get me a poor substitute, but
I will gladly take it.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Although it was fun thinking about, I was in Professor Bullock's class 20 years ago, and I was sitting next to Chuck Efstration, who's now a state representative for Gwinnett. And I was sitting next to Sachin Varghese, who was the SGA president at the time, but now he's a top attorney for the Democratic Party. And so one of the things that he and the late, great journalism professor Conrad Fink always said to me was, the students, look around you, the students that you're in with right now will continue to be movers and shakers in the Georgia world writ large. And he was exactly right.
Well, what's it like to be required reading in Chuck Bullock's Southern politics?
Yeah,
class?
one of Martha Zoller, a radio host who's taking his class, I guess by audit. I'm not sure, but she sent me that I was on his syllabus list, and it was the most sort of pinch me moment I could ever imagine. Because I used to sit in that class in like the 17th row, and I remember Jim Galloway and Tom Baxter came in one time, and I just walked out. I said, I want to be like you one day. And of course they were like, okay, who is this guy? But I also, back then, the Red and Black was a daily newspaper. And I had basically a slot every day in the Red and Black's next day's front page. And oftentimes I would use Dr. Bullock's speakers as a springboard to the story I was writing. And so if there wasn't an engaging speaker, I'd have to go find some other front page story for the next day.
So thinking back to 2020, and I know when I think back to 2020, it was absolutely exhausting. Was there ever a moment covering the elections in 2020, or sort of the long 2020 or long 2016, I suppose, where you were just like, make this stop?
Yeah, sure. Right now, I mean, I was on the phone with the Walker campaign and the Warnock campaign on the way up here about debates. And I'm like, guys, let's just figure this out. Can I mediate this right now? Can we just figure out the debate? But no, certainly. I mean, that part of our job is to deal with the tedious stuff and to go to the events in far-flung places. I actually love those events the most. If I'm down in Camilla, Georgia, or Ocilla, or Toccoa, or any other city with the ends with the OA, I love it. But no, it's a lot. And I have to kind of warn my wife around this time of year. It's like, look, I might be gone a lot more in the next few weeks. And she gets it by now because we've been together since UGA, since October something. And I should know this, October 2001. Yeah, geez, more than half my life. But it does get a lot, but also it's a privilege, right? It's everything I could have ever imagined when I was a student here at UGA, was to be able to cover Georgia politics for the AJC. And I wanted to work for the AJC since I was in the 4th grade, when the Braves beat reporter at the time, I.J. Rosenberg, came to my 4th grade class and said something. I don't remember what, but I remember going home and telling my mom I wanted to be a reporter. And she said, you have to learn how to type. I said, never mind. But my cousin Eleanor Ringel was the film critic for the AJC for a long time. So it's always been a dream. And to be able to cover at a time where there is now a lot more interest. I mean, in 2016, I'd go to campaign events with Stacey Abrams. And I'd be I wish I was kidding, the only reporter there. 2014, Kemp and Carter, the only reporter at many, many events. Stacey would joke, hey, we might as well do this at the AJC's office. And then to see the race transform, and now Washington Post, New York Times, they have bureaus in Atlanta that cover these races, political reporters in Atlanta assigned to these races. Other outlets are coming in. So Georgia's just raised, has grown as a very important battleground.
Was there an aha moment where you said, oh, this is different? and you realized that you were living and working in the sort of political epicenter of the universe?
The first was in 2017 when I said I was in 2016. I was kind of anywhere but Atlanta for a while. And in 2017, living where I live in Dunwoody, I could just, instead of having to fly to Ohio, I could walk to these major nationally watched campaign events. At Dunwoody High School, 2 miles from my house, there was this big, huge 6th district debate with John Ossoff and literally 20 other candidates for that seat before the special election. That was my first aha moment because I'd see all these national reporters come down, and they would send truckloads of national reporters. For a little while, it was kind of just me, and then half the New York Times seemed to be down here. In part because I think a lot of those reporters wanted an excuse to get out of New York around the summertime. And then the other big aha moment also involves the Times. I was up in somewhere, like I think it was in Toccoa, actually. I already gave 2 shout outs to Toccoa with Stacey Abrams in 2018, kind of probably around June or July. And their one of their local correspondents who's assigned to general topics, not politics, was there. And he goes, Bluestein, just get ready. There's about to be an army of New York Times reporters down here to cover Stacey Abrams. And I said, oh, and I told my bosses, it's like, we need backup. It's going to be a lot. And he was right. I mean, with that race, New York Times is still covering this race, but it's very different. I mean, it seemed like everything Stacey Abrams said was at the top of the web page in New York Times. She was new. We in Georgia, of course, knew of her, but even a lot of Georgians were learning more about her at the time. But for the national audience, she was very new and all the time was making headlines.
So sort of process question, because that's what everybody comes here for. What made you decide, you, a reporter who works on deadlines, I'm going to write a book about this incredibly exhausting, exhilarating experience?
Well, both exhausting and exhilarating. And you're right. I'm a deadline guy. I still write. I think today I have 3 or 4 bylines. It's part of my nature, for better or for worse. Editors have tried to beat it out of me. So write less and work on 1 story a week, but I can't. There's newsletters and podcasts and all these things that now are a big part and an important part of our product at the AJC. We get that the print newspaper is not going to be something that certainly my kids, but even it's not going to be something that lasts a very long time. And so we've got to adapt to it. And so I am a deadline driven guy. I can work on 3 or 4 stories at the same time, but never, to me, working on a story for 2 weeks is a really long time. So working on a book for 6 months seemed like a very big challenge. And around November of 2020, a book agent called me out of the blue and said, I think you got a book here. And I said, yeah, I'm in the middle of a runoff campaign that could decide control of the US Senate. What do you think? And he goes, well, I think you've got something here. Go ahead and start thinking about writing a book proposal. And to his credit, he nudged me and helped me through that process, because writing a book is obviously it's so different than my normal job. And the industry is very strange and weird. And basically over that month, I wrote a 90-page book proposal and still wasn't sure if I had anything, but I wanted to make sure that I at least gave myself a chance. And I wanted to have it in right before the runoff. The runoff was January 5th. And I wanted to have it into all these book publishers, they were all on vacation while we were all working, but I wanted to make sure they had it in by January 1st. So I finished it in the middle of the runoffs. I'd work nights and weekends and all that. And then January 6th happened, January 5th happened, then January 6th happened. And I think it sharpened even more attention on what happened in Georgia. And a week later was when the publishers got to ask me questions. And it was a very good, it was a very strange but enjoyable process. And I was fully going into it thinking that, hey, if there's no book, I tried, I did my best. But I got, of the 7 publishers, I think 6 of them made offers. And so my agent was like, you have a book. And then I go into the process. Then it gets even weirder, because you think as a new author, that there's this whole team around you that's gonna, here's what chapter 1 should look like, and let's talk about what chapter 2. No, it was kind of like, go do your thing. I'll talk to you in 5 months. If you need any help, call me. And that freaked me out a little bit, because this was my first book. So I thought there'd be a whole team of fact checkers and, collaborators around me. And it is you were kind of out there. I was actually talking with an author yesterday who had the same exact experience with his book, but you kind of feel like you're at this island alone. Meanwhile, I still was working at the AJC. We don't have a real big book leave process. So there's a legislative session where they're passing new voting laws and all sorts of other controversial things that are coming up right now. So I called my agent a week later and got together with the book editors, and we had a really good conversation. And basically they said, do your thing. We bought the book because we trust you. Go do it. And I kind of set myself my own deadlines. I wanted to go done with section 1 by the end of February, section 2 by the end of March, and section 3 by the end of April, and then lots of edits and rewrites and all that good stuff. So it was a very different, the most challenging professional thing I've ever done in my professional life, but then also probably the most rewarding.
Now to prepare, did you go back and read the great campaign chroniclers, Teddy White, Jules Witcover, Richard Ben Cramer?
Yeah, and I had already read those, but yes,
Yeah.
I would read also more contemporary ones, like John Allen's book.
Mm-hmm.
John Allen helped me a lot. If you ever listen to this, he also scared the crap out of me because he was in the middle of his like last weeks when I called him. I said, should I do this? And he's like, I haven't seen my kids in weeks. I haven't, and it freaked me out a little bit. And I also had a very good conversation with my wife where I was like, this is not going to take over my life. Because I still, I want to coach my kids. I'm a very bad softball coach, but I coach my kids softball. I wanted to do all those things that you want to do as a dad. So it all worked out, but I definitely reread those. I spent about 2 weeks and just did, 50 interviews just in 2 weeks, hour-long interviews, many of them. Just got like the groundwork done. I, of course, had done reporting that whole year, but not with the thought of writing a book about it. So I had to convert some of that. And then over the next few months, I just did more and more.
So you worked for the AP for several years. In 2012, you came to the
Yes,
AJC.
yeah.
So how, and this gets to the crux of the book, but how did Georgia politics change from 2012 to 2020? And what are the major factors that you explore in your book?
Yeah, when I got to the AJC, they hired me as the Associated Press. I covered a lot of breaking news, also the legislative session and politics. But my main job was covering legal affairs, so I covered every big trial in Georgia, Brian Nichols, and I covered, unfortunately, every execution in Georgia for a period of 3 years. So I spent way too much time at the Jackson State Prison, and I'd travel all around for big, huge stories. And I wanted to put an end to that once my wife had our first kid, Nicole, who's now 11. And so we readjusted. And at that point, I was looking for, I actually talked to Conrad Fink, the late great Conrad Fink, the journalism professor, because he was a former AP executive. And he steered so many students, not just me, but probably more than a dozen journalism students toward the AP. And I loved the AP for a while, and then for a while I didn't. And I actually, shortly before he died, we had this very good conversation where he basically said in his distinctive growl, Bluestein, I wish I could do it, but he essentially said, Bluestein, your version of the AP is different from mine. He gave me license to leave the AP. And I felt like I needed that from Fink because he was such an important, I don't want to get emotional, but he was such an important part of my college experience. And once I kind of got that license, I took the job at the AJC actually covering business with the understanding that I could get another job. There was never really written out, but I covered economic development, and it was an awesome beat because it helped me learn how to better develop sources, how to do what I do every day now. I had to go after coffee and happy hours and lunches with all sorts of business executives who did not want to talk to the AJC. There was very little in it for them. They weren't running campaigns. And then after 6 months of that, they switched me over to cover politics, and I loved it. And it was a sort of a backwater beat. I mean, it was still an important beat at the AJC, don't get me wrong, but it was not a national beat. Very few people were watching what Governor Nathan Deal was doing at the time. Occasionally, when he signed into law a big gun expansion, it would get national news, but very limited, very little sort of, it was not on MSNBC or CNN or Fox News every day. It was very rarely getting the big national headlines. But here in Georgia, of course, it was important. And it's something I remind my editors still to this day. I said, even if the governor's race doesn't look, if we get closer to November and the governor's race doesn't look like it's as competitive as we thought it would be, it's still, frankly, I mean, the Senate race is important too, but the governor's race is still, to me, the most important race because what the governor, whether it be Kemp, the second term, or Governor Stacey Abrams does, will have the most impact on our daily lives.
Yeah, talking about the the scope of this book, 2016 to 2020, thereabouts, that periodization seems to suggest that there are two major factors in the sort of flipping of Georgia: Donald Trump and Stacey Abrams. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, I think it is, because in one hand, Donald Trump helped polarize the Atlanta suburbs, right? We expected on 2016 for Donald Trump to win Georgia by 5 to 8 points. What we did not expect is for Cobb County, Gwinnett County, and then Henry County to flip blue, and certainly Cobb. The first time since 1980, right? The first time since Jimmy Carter was in the White House to flip blue. And so that was a transformative moment, and to see him continue to galvanize voters and really also, in a sense, help Republicans as well. It wasn't just detrimental. Governor Kemp won his election, in his words, by building a red wall out sort of in this part of town. I mean, further northeast, but in northeast Georgia, counties where Trump won with 90% of the vote, 80% of the vote, Kemp would win with 90% of the vote, right? He would outdo even Donald Trump's margins in 2018 by building what he sees as this red wall. And then the Stacey Abrams factor. Now it's sort of common conventional wisdom, but to see a Democrat come out against abortion restrictions and come out for gun control and a lot of the other stances she's taken was not typical. Gay rights, all these issues that we're talking about as standard practice right now for Democrats. She was the one to sort of pioneer a lot of this. She was really one of the first Democrats to talk about gun control. Jason Carter, near the very end of his campaign, and this is not a knock on Jason at all, but near the very end of his campaign, he endorsed same-sex marriage, was not talking about gun control. When Barack Obama came to town doing his 2014 campaign, Jason Carter was out in South Georgia, hanging out with peanut farmers. Like it was what you did as a Democrat back then. And now Stacey Abrams you're still seeing her run very closely to President Biden, even though his approval ratings are underwater in Georgia, whether they're 30s or 40s, we're not really sure. Professor Hood will tell us very soon when his poll comes out for us in a few weeks. But she kind of transformed the game by saying we can energize, as Democrats, we can energize voters who don't usually vote in midterm elections by embracing these issues that many Democrats before her didn't.
Right. So looking at the cover of your book, you've got President Biden, Lucy McBath, former President Trump, John Ossoff, Reverend Senator Warnock.
We're just missing Charles Bullock.
Yeah, exactly. Stacey Abrams, David Perdue, Kelly Loeffler, Brian Kemp. Going back to 2012, the only one of those figures who was involved in the only two figures involved, or three rather, Biden, Abrams, and Kemp. Okay. Of the rise of all these individuals, whose was the unlikeliest in politics? Yeah, the strange thing is that all those people in the country, they're still involved in somewhere. I mean, other than maybe David Perdue, they're still involved in some form or fashion. That's a good question. Other than Trump, the most unlikeliest rise. I can go for a few. We at the Capitol knew that Stacey Abrams was a superstar in terms of the way that she would affect legislation, even when Republicans knew she would never support it. I mean, I saw her change, a number significant, but also legislation that we never even write about. She'd find laws and legal issues with it and compel Republicans to change it. But I wasn't sure how she'd be as a motivator, right? I mean, we saw her talk about arcane legal theories in committee rooms, but never really saw her on the campaign trail. And for me, one of the first big moments was after Donald Trump won. It was in January 2017, and Stacey had been building this campaign operation for a while before she announced. And one of her aides said, "You need to be at it's Labor Union Hall in downtown Atlanta on a Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon." And it was Stacey Abrams' first major speech. And it was the first time that I got to see her in a different way, right? On the campaign trail, because it wasn't like she needed to be on the campaign trail a lot for her state house seat, which was solidly Democratic, and see her as a motivator. And I got to see her really light up this crowd, and that was my holy crap moment. It was like she could really do this thing. And she said something at the time that I still
I still will never forget. It was something like, she said, if I could cry, I would, because it shows she's just you would be surprised. She's very introverted. She does not like the attention. She doesn't like going to the grocery store and getting flooded with people. She'd probably prefer watching, she's very into Star Trek as most of the people in this, but she's a TV buff and she's a writer and she's an author and she does all this other stuff. So, going and being the center of attention isn't necessarily her bag, but she grown into that role.
Mhm.
I don't think many people would imagine Kemp in this role back then. He was a kind of a low-key Secretary of State. We were looking at the time in 2012 as maybe Sam Olens, certainly Casey Cagle as being a statewide Republican candidate. David Perdue was he was not mentioned at all in 2012. Of course, we talked about his cousin Sonny, but David, we first started hearing buzz about him in 2013. And of course, we know how that ended. But he wasn't even on the radar of many people. And then John Ossoff is maybe the least likely of anyone. I was visiting a friend at a hospital in Gwinnett County in January of 2017. And I'd written a story saying, here's who could run, because Tom Price had just stepped down from 6th District. And I wrote a story of here's who could run for that seat. Every single name, this is my fault, but every single name was Republican. I didn't even think a Democrat had any chance. And I got this call out of the blue in my car. It was this guy. Hey, it's John Ossoff. I was like, okay, cool. Hey, and he said, I don't know who he was. And he said, hey, I'm going to run for House. I'm going to announce my bid tomorrow. And I'd like you to break the story. And I said, and by that point, 5 or 6 other people had run in. So, okay, here's another one. And he said, and I have John Lewis's endorsement, Hank Johnson's endorsement, and $250,000 in money lined up. And I said, okay, you're legit. But again, who are you? And it took him a while to find his bearings. And remember, at first in that race, he was running as a make Trump furious candidate, and he ended up becoming more centrist. And I think he really is more of that first version of John Ossoff than the second version. And I think he learned that through his defeat in 2017. And he embraced, just like Stacey Abrams embraced the core Democratic ideals. He did too. And one of the reasons I think he won his Senate runoff campaign was because he ran as a liberal.
Mhm. So you talked about a 90-page book proposal. I'm not sure what the book comes in at, 350 something. Is there anything not in the book that you wanted to put in the book?
That's a good question. Because there's always stuff that kind of got lost on the cutting room floor. And I wanted to go into some more history that we had to streamline some of that. There's a COVID-related paper shortage at the time, which is something I had no idea about. So a bunch of books got delayed because of that. It's all this weird sort of. But one of the things that I tried not to do, actually, I know a lot of gossip in the political world. That's just part of my job, right? I know who doesn't like who and who harbors a grudge. When I see so-and-so being quoted saying negative stuff about whoever, I often know, well, they've hated each other since 2016. Like, I know that stuff. What I didn't want to make this book about was, for better or for worse, was that. I didn't want to say how XYZ hates this or that person. And part of it too is part of the reason that I was able to write the book I wanted to write was because I can talk to Republicans and Democrats. I mean, that's my job at the AJC. I go to Republican events as often as I go to Democratic events. Every day I'm literally talking to 30, 40 sources, many of them Republican, many Democrats. Not everyone likes me. I get it. I don't, I might feel the same way, but that's my job, is to talk to those folks. And I also had to keep that in mind, because this wasn't just a book I was going to put out and then quit. I'm done. I'm still working in this world, and not to say I pulled any punches, because I really tried not to, but I wanted to make it as good of an all-encompassing look at what happened in 2020 and before, without kind of getting into some of the gossipy stuff.
Right. So, looking ahead, are we still living in the world of 2020, or is this a new era? Is this have we moved on from 2020?
That's a great question, because in many ways we haven't. I mean, we're still seeing some Republicans, including some very senior Republicans, perpetuate lies about the election of 2020. Right? We're still hearing Democrats attack Republicans for that, which is fair game, right? And certainly last year, it felt like 2020 would never end. But we've also sort of turned a corner in a sense, because I think the May primaries, I wrote about this a few times in the AJC, but what I think we've seen is the Civil War. It's not necessarily kaput. It's not over in the Republican Party, but I think that Brian Kemp and the Republicans on Trump's bad side, because they're not anti-Trumps. They're not never Trumpers. Brian Kemp still won't say a bad word about Donald Trump, and neither will Chris Carr or others who didn't get his endorsement. But they have won this big battle. And in Professor Hood's poll, 95% or so of Republicans are backing Brian Kemp. So the governor and his allies are doing whatever they can not to antagonize the Trump supporters, but they've won this battle right now. And so there's still 20, and certainly, with the special grand jury going on and with other news coming out of Washington and with the very big likelihood that Donald Trump could soon announce a comeback bid, and also could soon come to Georgia. I thought there was no chance he'd come to Georgia, but I've changed my mind about that. There's a decent chance he could come back to Georgia and rally for Herschel Walker, Burt Jones, and whoever else wants to show up, and probably come out to North Georgia. By the way, he wouldn't go to Metro Atlanta. So we have not put to rest 2020, but I think Georgia is maybe one of the only states that has at least started to turn that corner.
So it's post Labor Day, so people are theoretically paying attention. Those who don't follow politics, the TikTok, like all of us. But what's the state of the race today, September 9th?
It'll be hard to avoid anything political, as everyone in this room knows. More than $250 million in ads have been booked or reserved for this final stretch. So you're not going to be able. I was watching U.S. Open with my wife last night, and back to back ads. It almost feels like the runoff all over again. The candidates are also spending their money in innovative ways too. So it's not all on ads, but still, you'll hear media gurus and campaign advisors still say this. TV and traditional spending on direct mail and TV still is their favorite way of getting their message out. $2 million behind a certain ad overwhelms 16 AJC front pages these days. That's just the way it is. The state of the race is still in flux, but we're seeing some dynamics hardening. Governor Kemp is ahead of Stacey Abrams in just about every public poll. Even if you take away one that came out yesterday that from a conservative leaning outfit, he's still ahead 4, 5, 6 points in public polls, and in some internal polls, I've seen him ahead even more. Stacey Abrams in her internal poll, she's back by 1 or 2 points, but she gets it. She's an underdog. She is relying on a hope that the Supreme Court Dobbs decision will expand the electorate in ways that the polls aren't picking up. We've seen evidence of that in other primaries. We've seen what happened in Kansas. You never count Stacey Abrams out. Republicans will never count Stacey Abrams out at all. She is an elite fundraiser and one of the most formidable candidates in modern Georgia history. At the same time, the dynamics, the economic climate, the fact that Joe Biden's popularity is still sagging in Georgia, and the fact that Governor Kemp is using all the tools of his incumbency to his advantage, including all sorts of announcements of billions of dollars and hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding that Republicans, including him, did not support when Congress passed it. It's all playing to his advantage. The Senate race is much, much closer. A lot of the polls show them within the margin of error, including that poll that I just mentioned that came out with Fox 5 last night. So that's a toss-up. If you gave both the campaign, Warnock and Walker's campaign advisors truth serums and said you have to answer who's going to win, they'll say runoff. They think we're going to a runoff. Who knows if it will once again decide control of the U.S. Senate. It would be good for a sequel, I guess. But but we really could be headed. Luckily, this time a runoff would only ruin our Thanksgivings, not our Christmases, Hanukkahs, and New Year's, because the legislature changed the rule. It's only a 4-week runoff. So we'd have a December 8th. We'd have a December runoff, early December, rather than all the way into January.
One of the characters, one of the individuals that you talk about in the book that sort of came out of nowhere. I'm sure his Forsyth County constituents would say otherwise, but Jeff Duncan, who came out of nowhere to defeat David Schaefer, a very veteran Republican hand for the Republican nomination for lieutenant governor, has opted not to run for reelection. Did he provide any insight to that? And also, what's the dynamic with Burt Jones as the nominee? At the top of the ticket, you have Brian Kemp, who very conspicuously stood up to President Trump and Rudy Giuliani and the White House and the former president's campaign operation. And Burt Jones, you have the opposite, somebody who was involved in the sort of fake elector scheme that's being investigated now. So what can you say to that?
Jeff Duncan is one of the most fascinating political characters I've ever covered. He announced his race. Sometimes you have these big rollouts and campaign strategists, and nowadays you have YouTube videos that go along with when you announce your campaigns. He announced his campaign to be at a Caribou Coffee in the middle of like December years ago with his dad kind of like trying to overhear what we were saying at another table. And he's like, Dad, stay over there. He was a backbench state lawmaker, who very few people, even in the Georgia House, I think I looked them up right before that story. We had maybe quoted him once or twice, right? He was not someone that many, even people who were really closely following Georgia politics had heard of. But he ran an unconventional campaign. He capitalized on David Schaefer's issues involving all sorts of other things. But also, even though he had sort of the political establishment against him, he and Brian Kemp almost ran as a tag team as these two outsiders who were willing to buck the establishment. And now, as you mentioned, he is one of those few Republican politicians who are never Trumpers. He's out there saying that Donald Trump should not run for election again, that Donald Trump is a distraction, that Republicans should go focus on what his version of GOP 2.0. I asked him that very question. We had an AJC live event. Our business is changing dramatically, and we're now doing all these live events. And I was with him and former Governor Roy Barnes and my AJC colleague Patricia Murphy on stage on Tuesday. And I asked him that question: do you regret not running now, knowing that other people who are on Trump's bad side, like the governor, like Chris Carr, like John King, like Brad Raffensperger, maybe the biggest surprise of all, easily won their primaries? And he said, I have no regrets. I've done what I wanted to do in my 4 years. If you gave him a true serum, I'm not sure what he'd really say there. But I asked him about Burt Jones as well. And that's so fascinating to me because I'm often in the Georgia Senate. It's nice to, as a reporter there, because you have direct, it's like this. I'll sit there in the back and you can sit there and talk to the state senators. You're not divided by glass or you're not on a different floor. And you can talk to state senators in the middle of votes. I mean, and there's this sort of give and take. It's very collegial. It's very personal. It's very intimate, I guess is the good word. And whenever Jeff Duncan would be up there talking, giving a speech, or Burt Jones would be back. Sometimes he'd be back with the press doing anything he could not to listen to Jeff Duncan. So the animosity between those two men was not hard to see. And so my question to the Lieutenant Governor was, look, we know you're not BFFs, but why haven't you endorsed him? And he said, first, well, Burt Jones never asked for my endorsement. And everyone kind of said, okay, that's a cop-out. And that's why I thought the answer would end. But he went further and said, I will not endorse someone who questioned the election results. My family got death threats, and I wrote about it extensively in the book. He'd have security. His sons, one of his sons who goes to UGA, was being blasted and attacked by pro-Trump trolls on Twitter. And folks like us might be used to it, but when you're an 18-year-old, 17-year-old, 16-year-old, and you're getting death threats on Twitter from these, far right, whatever, it's a holy crap moment, right? It's something else. And you could hear, and I had that audio on my latest Politically Georgia podcast, but he goes into depth about what that did to his family. And he says, frankly, I can't endorse someone who perpetuated those falsehoods, those lies about the election results.
So yeah, I know what the answer is based on my Hulu and YouTube commercials, but what are the issues that are on the Democratic and Republican side that are the driving forces that are going to be with us through November?
We have gone through a litany. You've had all sorts of ads, but really what it's going to boil down to is the economy. Professor Hood's polls and every other public poll we've seen has showed that a mix of inflation, the economy are the top factors in this election. That's not to say abortion and other issues like guns aren't big issues. And to a significant number of Georgians, not only major issues, but they are their determining factors for their votes. But at the same time, even Stacey Abrams, even Senator Warnock's campaigns will acknowledge, yeah, inflation is going to be the top issue. So what Governor Kemp and Herschel Walker just say, it's the Warnock-Biden inflation, or the Abrams-Biden inflation. And what you're seeing Senator Warnock do is, of course, since the passage of the federal, what they call the Inflation Reduction Act, but the federal climate tax healthcare bill, is channel his message towards that. The Democrats are doing something to bring down inflation. Stacey Abrams has said the same, and she's kind of added a new wrinkle by saying that Republican policies, Republicans' anti-abortion policies, Republican gun policies are costing Georgia's business reputation. So the other day, we led the morning newsletter, the morning Jolt, with a new letter that was out from dozens of executives who voiced that fear. So she's trying to tie those very important issues with maybe the most important issue, the economy, together as one sort of package deal.
So Georgia shocks the nation in 2020. Where were you on election night? By the way?
2020. So the Democrats weren't having election parties.
That's right.
Because of the coronavirus
that's right.
pandemic. And Republicans didn't have the same concerns. And I was out there on the campaign trail all the time anyway. My wife is an executive at Emory Midtown, so she was at the hospital every day. I was on the campaign trail. Frankly, by the end of it, I was dragging my kids out with me because they were doing virtual school at home, and so their days would end at like 1 p.m. Like, you guys want to go see John Ossoff? And to their credit, they were great sports, and they ended up, it was awesome, but they ended up interviewing all 4 runoff candidates, something they called Bluestein blogs. They did these YouTube series. My wife will never let me make it public, but they're great. And they interviewed Ossoff about all the campaign ads, and this was before the senator had his firstborn daughter, and so he wasn't as comfortable with kids. But it gave this arcane answer about McCain-Feingold, and you could see his aide in the background. Saying. Kelly Lefferman did the same exact thing. She's talking about radical. I mean, even my daughters gave her the soft. Why do we always see these negative ads? And she went on and on about radical liberal Raphael Warnock, and my daughter's like looking up at me like, oh. Senator Warnock gave a great answer to the question about why being a pastor helps prepare him for public office more so than being a lawyer or being a politician. And at the end of his answer, he says, "That's a better question your dad's ever asked me." The best one was when we tracked down. This was at a time when David Perdue was not letting us know where he was going for events. He didn't want the Atlanta media covering him, and so I'd have tipsters say he's going to be in Madison. He's going to be wherever. And so I found out he was going to be in Madison on a Saturday afternoon. So I dragged my kids, and he was 2 hours late. But when he finally showed up, I said, "Okay, Senator," I asked him whatever question I needed for my stories. But I said, "Senator, my kids want to ask you a question." And so he gets down on one knee, and my 11-year-old now asks him, "So, Senator, do you think schools should reopen?" Because at the time they were still doing virtual school. And he gets down on the knee and he goes, "I don't know, little girl. What do you think?" And it was the biggest cop I ever. Wait, what was the question again?
Where were you on election?
So on election night with the Democrats, I was with the Republicans on election night because they were still having events, and I was actually the lead into my book where I was watching all these Republican aides. I was watching interns and volunteers and just donors celebrate and having oh my God, Tennessee just went Republican, all the stuff we expected to happen that night. And then I saw the operatives and the campaign staffers freaking out, like looking at their phones, faces turning away. Oh, we lost Arizona, right? They were freaking out. And that to me was this juxtaposition of the people who kind of knew what was going on, knew that this was going to be a very, very long few days. Whereas, folks just watching TV, okay, yeah, Trump's winning all the states he should win. Biden's winning all the states he should win. Mm-hmm. And then at runoff night, same thing. Democrats didn't have a party. John Ossoff was meditating. He was at home, relaxed, in this by himself in his living room. A few aides were outside his house. Senator Warnock was in a campaign office with just a few of his closest aides. And meanwhile, the Republicans were at the Grand Hyatt in Buckhead, giant party, pimento cheese, all this really fancy food. And I got a hotel room there because I thought it was going to be an all-nighter. Little did I know that the election was essentially over by like 2 a.m.
Mhm. So before we open it up for questions, I want to put you on the spot and ask you to prognosticate for us. Say, for the sake of argument, Stacey Abrams defies the polls that you were talking about, and she becomes Georgia's first Democratic governor since Roy Barnes.
First black female governor in Georgia, first female governor in Georgia.
Mhm. First black female governor in the country. What does the 2023 legislative session look
I think Stacey Abrams will put expanding Medicaid above everything else. And she can do that. That's why it's all bets are off. I can kind of predict Governor Kemp, what he'll do in a second term in terms of Medicaid expansion. He'll pursue a more limited Medicaid expansion. There's still not that huge appetite among Republicans, although I don't know how the Atlanta Medical Center's closing will change all that. But Stacey Abrams, all bets are off because she could literally say, hey, I'll sign the budget and I'll sign other crucial must-pass legislation, but everything else I will not sign until Medicaid expansion passes. So there's a chance. Who knows? I mean, it's sort of chaos theory if that happens. But no one ever counts Stacey Abrams out. And as a negotiator, she could drive a hard bargain with Republicans because Republicans will maintain control of the legislature. But it'll be harder for Republicans, even under Governor Kemp's second term, because they'll lose a few seats. And the fringe Republicans who vote no on everything. And there's a few of those who just are very willing to make Speaker David Ralston's life more difficult. That will narrow Republican margins even more. So it'll be either way, it'll be really strange and interesting legislative session. But I think with Stacey Abrams as governor, Medicaid expansion above all, and she'll try to repeal the anti-abortion laws, some of the gun expansions. It'll be very, very tough to do that. But what she could do is she could do a rewrite of some of those. She could maybe find a compromise to expand or to lessen some of these abortion restrictions or to add new wrinkles to some of these gun expansions.
Do you think there are enough moderate Republicans, suburban Republicans in the legislature to do that?
There's not many. And that's why it would depend on brokering compromises, because we saw most of the moderate Republicans kind of wink out in 2014, 2016 elections.
In 2018.
And 2018 was kind of the last of them. And now you've got areas like mine where I'm in Dunwoody, and that used to be the home of the moderate Republican. And now he moved. Mike Walensky, I went to high school with Mike. And he was the state representative. He was the first Democrat to win Dunwoody in modern Georgia history. And he wasn't even that politically active before he ran for office. So you've seen those districts go pretty decisively to the Democrats.
So the flip side of the argument, Stacey Abrams loses. She loses badly. Where does that leave Stacey Abrams? Where does that leave the Democratic Party of Georgia? Where does that leave the concept of a flipped Georgia?
Well, back when Stacey Abrams started running, there wasn't as deep as of a Democratic bench as there is now. But now you've got other superstar Democrats in Georgia who have Senator Warnock might even be a better fundraiser than Stacey Abrams right now, and has a huge national profile. John Ossoff doesn't have to worry about re-election until 2026. And now we're seeing with these races, other more, I guess, considered more rank and file Democrats step up and assert themselves. Jen Jordan, who's running for Attorney General, if she loses, this is not the end of Jen Jordan by any means. Bean Wen, same thing. And Michelle Au is a state senator who's running for State House, who very quickly made herself one of the preeminent leading state senators. She'll be a force in the State House if she wins her race. So there's a bench for Democrats. What happens to Stacey Abrams next is not as again, I've said it twice already. I'll say it again. You never count Stacey Abrams out. She parlayed her defeat in 2018 to even, bigger national stature, where she literally was on Joe Biden's potential running mate list after losing a gubernatorial election. She gave the rebuttal to the State of the Union, right? So will she kind of go into go do something more privately for a while? I don't know. Or will she stay in the mix and continuing pushing for Medicaid expansion and voting rights? I kind of think the latter. But she kind of viewed her 2018 defeat as this almost like a 5 stages of grieving. And it took a really long time to get to the acceptance stage. It took her months. But when she got it, that is when she kind of convinced herself and was determined to run again. And that's why I never thought she was going to run for U.S. Senate or any other office. And I never thought she was going to skip this race. This was a race that I always knew she was going to do a rematch.
It took Newt Gingrich 3 tries to
Yeah.
get where he wanted to go. So
And ask Johnny Isaacson.
very true. Absolutely. So, is there another book out there? You got one in you?
I don't know the sequel yet to this. I don't know the ending yet to this sequel. I'd love to write one, but I just don't know what November or beyond will bring. But this time I've actually at least been taking notes. In advance,
there
so I didn't have to recreate.
That's
the
an
wheel.
important
Yes.
part
Yes.
of the process. So before, for the rest of the time that we have, I wanted to go ahead and throw open questions to the audience, and we've already got hands in the air. Yeah, if you don't mind. I'll go ahead and turn mine off. So that way they don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from Greg.
I know he does.
We all know about water and pizza that can't be given out anymore, if that ever mattered a ton. That's what got a lot of national attention. Beyond that, the county boards being taken over, the unlimited amount of ability to challenge any voter in the state by anyone, whether they're in the state or not. What are you most concerned about? Or what, if you're someone who believes that more people should vote, what are the parts of that law that really will affect voter tabulation of votes, counting the votes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if those who didn't hear the first part is basically what the impact of 2021's election will have. And one of the answers we don't know yet, because we haven't really seen we have mayoral elections, we have primaries, but we haven't seen an election that will have nearly the turnout that we're about to see in November. And most of that law was aimed at mail-in votes, right? Has limited effect on in-person voting. That you mentioned the giving out pizza and water at lines, but that got a lot of national attention. But the voting rights advocates that's the least of their concerns. They're concerned about that, but there's a number of other concerns. And there's a tighter window for mail-in ballots. There's tighter restrictions on ballot drop boxes. There's, of course, the new voter ID checks for absentee ballots. So those are changes that I can tell you Stacey Abrams' campaign and Senator Warnock's campaign are very concerned about the impact that will have specifically on mail-in votes. What we're watching the most closely are two things: the potential for unlimited challenges of those votes after these elections. We saw a lot of those attempts after the 2020 vote, and we see what happened in Coffee County. We see what happens in even counties where Trump and Republicans dominate. Coffee County is a 70-30 county. This is not a county where the outcome was not a surprise in Coffee County. But we saw too where sort of election deniers can have immense sway, but also giving the state legislature tremendously more oversight, potential for that oversight, or to take over local election boards is going to be something that will consume a lot of our attention. And this is again something that will happen after, maybe even the throes of the election or after the election, more than right now. So we're not sure, but in Fulton County, for instance, because of the pandemic, they approved all sorts of innovative ways to try to get increased turnout that under a different system would never have been approved, like motor voter, mobile voting sites, things like that, expanded drop box use, all these issues that you could see more conservative leadership not wanting to implement. So those are the two issues that we're most closely watching. And then when it comes to mail-in voting, we're just not sure. We expect an impact, but we're not sure. And it'll be really hard to say, this is the reason why Democrats, didn't get as many votes. It'd be hard to pin that down, but that's the nature of that law. You want me to call? Oh, sure. Over here, I can call. Yeah.
Thank you. On the topic of the challenging elections, I think a trend we're starting to see now, obviously in 2020, the big thing was challenging Joe Biden's victories. But in places like Arizona now, we're seeing in Republican primaries, Republicans accusing each other
Yeah.
of electoral fraud. Do you think that's going to continue being a trend and here in Georgia in some of these as we move forward when maybe a more Trump-aligned Republican loses a primary, which happened quite a bit, accusing other Republicans of somehow rigging ballots?
Yeah, that's the danger of once you go down this path, you never lose. And so I was surprised in a sense that Vernon Jones, when he ran for Congress out here and lost, I don't know, 70-30, that he didn't try to go to that route. I actually thought he would deny that he lost. So we haven't seen that happen in Georgia on a major scale that I can think of. I might be missing something. But I wouldn't be surprised because it's so deeply embedded in some of these campaigns. We did see that with an outlier candidate running for governor who said that she didn't lose and she had 50,000 people volunteering for her, so she must have had 50,000 votes. But that was about the extent we've seen it. But look, that's the path that we've seen sort of far right candidates go down. And what it does, of course, is it undermines confidence in our election system. And it's hard to restore that confidence. Yes, sir, over there. And then you. Yeah, the question was about Atlanta becoming even bigger. 5 million, it's already about half the votes, 5 million plus people in Atlanta, and what that will do to political campaigns in the future. And that's a huge question. And in 2018, to a degree, we saw Republicans retreat from Metro Atlanta. They were still spending millions of dollars in ads in Atlanta, but aside from a few visits here and there, Governor Kemp spent most of his time in rural Georgia, wanting to drive those margins up from 80% Trump counties to 90%. For his, but now we're seeing that shift back. The governor was just in the suburban Atlanta. Herschel Walker's been all over the suburbs of Georgia. You're hearing a lot of the Republican candidates talk about school issues to energize, swing voters in Atlanta suburbs, and they know that's where the votes are. So it's not to say Stacey Abrams has a 2,000-page rural policy. She did an hour-long interview with a rural reporter who's great, Charlie Hazelett, and she has a very in-depth. And of course, Governor Kemp, that is his base to this day. But at the same time, those strategies will shift, and that's good news. Probably good news for Democrats. You can't cement it in. That's why even if Democrats have these setbacks in November, they're looking at 2024 presidential race that will drive up turnout and a potential rematch with Donald Trump, who knows. And then a 2026 race where all these statewide ballots are back on and John Ossoff's up. So even if Democrats have a setback now, they only need to look 2 years from now to a completely different dynamic where Georgia could really become a seesaw state. Unlike some other states that flip blue and stayed blue or flip red and stayed red, Georgia could become a little bit more like, I don't know, North Carolina's not the best example, or Florida's not the best example, but it could be a state where it's 1%. It could go either way each election cycle. Oh, yes, ma'am. Mike Collins, yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. Is about far right Republicans who will have more sway over a Republican-controlled House if Republicans indeed take the House. And I think you mentioned Mike Collins here in the 10th district. The other example, easy example, is Marjorie Taylor Greene, and frankly, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Andrew Clyde, who used to represent this district, who were who ran in very comfortably Republican areas and easily won their nominations. And it's a big concern, just like I was saying in the Georgia legislature, how under Governor Kemp, it still will be very tough to negotiate with even with a decent sized Republican advantage. Same thing in the U.S. House, because you'll have a number of Republicans who could hold their own party hostage over issues like the debt ceiling. You know, we're barely talking about it now. But remember, in a Republican-controlled Congress, that was there was months of negotiations about passing extensions of the debt ceiling and passing budgets, and those issues could come to the forefront all over again because so many candidates, and Mike Collins is one of them, ran on a pro-Trump platform, but also ran on a pro-Marjorie Taylor Greene platform. I mean, campaigned with her. You know, was not afraid to say that she was not a sort of mentor or anything, but she was sort of in a way like a model, I guess, for his candidacy. Yes, ma'am. Well, we are fortunate at AJC to work with Professor Trey Hood, who handles our polls. And I think it's been since what, 2000 and it was after the Ossoff race, because that's when we fired her.
Yeah, it was 18.
Yeah. And so we have another poll. It's in the field now. We often ask some of the same questions, but we also ask different questions. And so we have a range of questions about social issues, about the abortion ruling, about guns in some of our recent polls. So we see that as our gold standard. But there's certainly other polls that we watch closely. There's some that have not as great of a reputation. Insider Advantage, the one that came out that I was mentioning yesterday, doesn't have that sort of same reputation, but it still is instructive. I mean, polls in general are seen as a snapshot. They're not necessarily predictors, but they're good ways to see the mood of the electorate at this moment. And we don't know the site. We don't know how drastically different the electorate will be. We know that 1.6 million more new voters have been added to the rolls since 2018. We don't know how many of them will vote. We don't know. They tend to skew Democratic, but we don't know how energized they'll be. And we also know that Stacey Abrams knows she has a problem with some of those new voters. She knows she has a problem even with African-American voters, the most important, the core of the Democratic Party of Georgia. And our polls and other polls show she's about 80% with Black voters, which seems like a big number, but she needs to get to 90. To win, she needs to be probably well above 90. And her campaign manager essentially says they treat African-American voters the same way they treat white suburban college-educated women in the suburbs, which is persuadable, that they're not taking them for granted. They have to go out. And I think it's right now. Tonight, she's doing an event with a number of significant, influential kind of influencers in the Black community to try to energize Black voters. But that's a long way of answering. There's a lot of different polls, but we think Trey's is the best. Yes, sir. The question about the green industry. We've got Rivian in East Georgia. We've got a huge solar power plant that builds solar panels up in Dalton. We've got the SK battery firm in Commerce. It's one of the biggest buildings I've ever seen. It goes on for like a mile. And now we've, of course, got the Hyundai plant that would build engines and EV vehicles down near Savannah. And these are huge jobs. I mean, Rivian and Hyundai account for 15,000 plus jobs. Those are the two biggest economic development deals in Georgia history. And there's a lot of pushback, right? There's a lot of people who are concerned about their way of life in Rutledge, Georgia, where the Rivian plant is going to be built, changing forever. Will it change political dynamics? That's a great question. We saw that even though David Perdue tried to make his opposition to Rivian a major part of his campaign, not just a little talking point here and there, but he would bring it up at his rally with Donald Trump, right? He'd bring it up in debates. Even though he tried to make his opposition to those plants a selling point, Brian Kemp still won the 4-county area around Rivian by like 80% of the vote. I mean, it wasn't even close. It will bring more money. These are high-paying jobs. You know, it's almost in the same vein as the film industry, where Republicans were concerned that 90,000 film workers from California will change the dynamic. And certainly a lot of them are voting Democratic. But are we seeing a long-term change from that? We're not quite sure yet. Yes, ma'am, there in the middle. Yes, so there is a huge gender gap anyway. But B, Black men are maybe Stacey Abrams' the hardest selling, the prickliest problem for her. And she said on the record, if I get Black men out to vote, I win. And it's Black men who tend to be always enjoy. I mean, not just in this election, but it's been a challenge for Democratic candidates. Black women are the most reliable, consistent, large block of voters for Democrats, period. And they vote in high numbers, and they're reliably Democratic, and they're going to support her with 90+%. It's Black men that's more of an issue. They undervote. They don't vote in these big numbers. And there are some, Governor Deal and Senator Isaacson, made a conscious effort doing their campaigns to reach out to Black men voters, and they ended up winning about double digits. Doesn't seem like a big, huge concept, but they won about 10, 12, 15% of Black voters in their races. And it wasn't the decisive factor, but it was a kind of a watershed moment for Republicans that they could get double digits of Black support, primarily because of Black men voting for them. Yes, right. Yeah. It's a great question about basically why Joe Biden hasn't come back. And it's in my story today about that. But Joe Biden hasn't been here since, I think it was January, when he had a big voting rights rally that Stacey Abrams actually didn't attend, and many voting rights groups boycotted. Stacey Abrams has a very different stance on Joe Biden. And back then, there's still a question about why she didn't attend that. I still don't have it. If I had that story, I would have written it. She said it was a long-standing commitment that she couldn't. But she is tying herself very aggressively to Joe Biden, or very assertively to Joe Biden on the campaign trail, talking about him at rallies in a way that Senator Warnock is not. So I think that Stacey Abrams would gladly, and she said it on the record, she'd gladly welcome Joe Biden. If you ask, I have asked Senator Warnock, I'm focused on whoever will help me help Georgians. So what he talks about on the campaign trail is that he has worked with Joe Biden on issues, but he's also worked with Ted Cruz and Tommy Tuberville and Marco Rubio on issues. And he says this in Democratic crowds, and you can hear the gasps. I mean, I've heard this speech 20 times, but you can hear the, oh, you're working with Ted Cruz. And he goes, yeah, I know. It's surprising that I work with Ted Cruz, but he's working with Ted Cruz on a legislation that would expand a federal highway to Texas. And he's saying, I think this will help spur development in West Georgia. That's why I'm working. And so he uses that not to try to, get their votes, because those guys are already voting for him, but I think really to appeal to the swing voters. Because right now, we didn't really talk, we're seeing a significant swing sort of split ticket trend. And we don't know if it will last, but in the last UGA AJC poll, 4% of Brian Kemp's supporters were voting for Senator Warnock, and another 4% were voting for the Libertarian. And that pretty much right there was the reason why Senator Warnock is a lot closer to Herschel Walker than he would otherwise be. And so I think that's a part of it. But if Joe Biden comes down and Senator Warnock doesn't show up, there'll be a world of difficulty too, because it'll look like he's betraying, the president of the United States. And it brings me back to 2014 when Barack Obama was in town. And as I said earlier, Jason Carter and Michelle Nunn were out meeting with farmers in rural Georgia. And it was not even, we didn't even shrug. We said, of course they're not, and now it's a different dynamic. Now we'd expect Democrats to try to show up. And I think the answer will be, he will not come down, but I think former President Obama will, because it's still easier for Democrats to tie themselves to Obama than it is to Biden. That's just my guess. Right back there. Yeah. So by May, I wasn't surprised by Brad Raffensperger winning, but if you had asked me a year, I didn't think Brad Raffensperger would even qualify to run. I thought he was done. He was the biggest surprise overall of this election cycle, because someone who, was so vilified. And remember, Senators Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, both 5 or 6 days after the general election, called for him to resign. I mean, he was just the punching bag. Even somewhat allies like Brian Kemp didn't want to be pictured anywhere near him, didn't want to have anything to do with him. He just became this pariah and a punching bag for national Republicans, and suffered much of the same backlash that Lieutenant Governor Duncan did: death threats, social media harassment, all sorts of terrible things. His family member's home got broken into. I share a story in the book about how a bunch of pro-Trump ralliers thought they were in his front yard, turned out to be some poor other person's house. But all sorts of bullying attempts that were really scary. And I thought he would kind of either just not run for re-election or just be a sort of go out fighting but losing. And instead, easily beats Jody Heiss, your now but future former congressman, and is ahead in our poll, 17 points ahead of Bean Wen. And most other polls show him ahead by double digits because of a significant number of Democratic crossover, but also he's holding a Republican core. So that would be a big surprise. But I think in general, I knew that Kemp would win. I knew that Chris Carter would win. I knew that John King would win the May primaries, but I didn't think it'd be by 50 points. I didn't think it'd be 70-22 or whatever it ended up being. And that was a huge, huge shock. And even David Perdue said, hey, I might lose, but it's not gonna be by 20 points. He was right, he lost by 50, So in this weird, bizarre world, David Perdue gets in the race to unite the Republican, because he wants to unite the Republican Party against Stacey Abrams. Well, he did, he just united it for the other guy. So, yes, back there. Well, thank you for the question. So it started right here, right? It started at UGA when I was living right down the street. We're in Russell and Creswell and the Myers. But I worked for the Red and Black. My right when and then the Tep House. Right when I got the UGA, I worked for the Red and Black my freshman year, and I just made it my mission. I was going to go and get hands-on experience. And again, some of the same people I cover today, I was covering the Red and Black back then. Adam Sparks is another name. He was the SGA president. He's a top lawyer for the Democratic Party. Kate Carter, Jason Carter's wife, was the editorial advisor of the Red and Black when I was there. And Jason Carter was a law student. These people, it gave me ground level experience. And it also, look, I wrote lots of stories that had problems in them, that I got backlash in. And you had this community, I've had professors, including the late, great Conrad Fink, who in the morning I'd get to his class and he would literally rip up my stories in front of me. And there'd be 20 other students. He would get on my nerves because some of the other students were journalism majors, but weren't working in any sort of media. And he knew that I was trying to recruit them and they weren't coming. And so he'd ask those other students, so-and-so, Mr. Whatever, why is Bluestein's article, wrong today? Or why did he do this? And it would tick me off so much, but it would also teach me this valuable lesson of, hey, we hold folks accountable. They can hold us accountable too. So I'd say the first thing is that ground level experience of getting to writing on a consistent basis, getting out there, looking for stories where you go, and getting internships in this modern media world. You got to be able to do, we said earlier, newsletters and podcasts and TV and radio and blogs. It's not just, writing for a newspaper like it was when I was here. I was actually a newspapers major, and that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't feel like I'm that old, but it doesn't even exist anymore. So, but I'd love to talk to you afterwards about anything else if you want to go into, yeah. Yes, sir, there. Yeah, you're at one of the core systemic problems we have in modern politics, which is a gerrymandered congressional districts. I mean, you can't gerrymander states, thankfully, but there's not a single real swing district in Georgia anymore. And you used to have two, not a huge number, but you used to at least have 6 districts and 7 districts were at least competitive. And now the 2nd district down in Southwest Georgia might be the closest we have, but even that's likely to go Democratic. But there's little incentive for lawmakers these days to go cross party lines and take moderate positions or buck their leadership or take stances that would tick off, the far right or the far left, because so many lawmakers are in safe districts. And there's also a media environment on the far left and the far right that encourages those types of stances. So Marjorie Taylor Greene can be a hero. We don't often write about her anymore. There's plenty of national media that do, but we don't often write about her. And when we do, in a sense, it plays into the whole what she wants in that sense, right? She wants people to be outraged at this or that tweet or this or that stance. And it's a hard line for us as journalists to figure out. But certainly that is, you're hitting at a systemic problem in our democracy. Yes, sir. Yeah, it could be the reason Stacey Abrams pulls off an upset victory, right? It could be the game changer in this election. She certainly thinks it will be and is banking her campaign about it. She's talking about the economy, but every week, every other day, it seems she's having a major event revolving around the anti-abortion law, and her ads are speaking both to the economy and to abortion. And there's some really scathing ads out there accusing Kemp of all sorts of positions that would energize Democratic voters. Our polls show a majority of Georgia voters oppose the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, and a significant majority of Georgia voters oppose an outright ban on abortion in Georgia, which is not what our state law does, but oppose going further. And so this is, there are some Republican supporters who hate the anti-abortion law, but like the rest of Governor Kemp's campaign, they're holding their nose and voting for it. And there's others, and I talked to the CEO of a company called Cardlytics, who said, I'm a Republican, and I usually vote for GOP candidates straight down the ballot, but I cannot vote for Governor Kemp this year because of the anti-abortion law. And that's going to be, depending on how many of those voters are out there, that could be a real difference maker in this election. Yes, sir. No. Yeah, the question is about the debate over the debates and whether or not Herschel Walker's 4th debate is better than what Senator Warnock's 3rd debate offer was. And it's so tedious I know it's important, because I don't want to downplay it, but it's so tedious as reporters to deal with it. Because just today on the way up here, I asked Herschel Walker at his last event, I said, I'll bite the bullet. I'll ask the debate question. Will you agree to a debate in Macon or Atlanta in addition to the Savannah debate? And he said, Warnock needs to put his big boy pants on and just do this debate in Savannah. And at this point, we're all tired of it. I'd love to see a debate. I'd love to see them on the same stage. I don't know if it will be this game-changing moment. It might be, but I'd love to get the chance to, ask both of them about certain policies that they can't really talk about on a campaign trail scrum, a media scrum, where we all, kind of attack the candidates in really quick sound bites. It'd be nice to see them talk to each other and debate each other. But no, is Walker's offer of a debate that different from Warnock's? No, I think they're just trying to be difficult. I think there's certainly, frankly, it's Herschel Walker, right? He's the one who said early on that he would debate Warnock any place, anytime, you name it. Warnock comes up and says, okay, here's 3 debates, you name it. And then Walker hedges for weeks and then says, I won't do any of these 3 debates. I'll do this 4th debate. So it's very confusing. It's very confusing for us to report about, honestly. But in the end, I'm pretty optimistic, and I haven't been for a while, but today I'm pretty optimistic we'll at least see a Savannah debate on October 14th. So I'll be there. Yeah. Oh, there's one more. Yeah. I'm trying to remember, but the question is about what Senator Warnock said about why being a pastor. And I think he genuinely believes this. He doesn't like politics, but he likes policy. And as a pastor, he got arrested protesting the Nathan Deal's opposition to expanding Medicaid. He would push for affordable housing, economic equality, all these issues that were near and dear to his church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and his congregants. And was, I knew of him. I don't know how many. He was very well known in Atlanta civic circles and Atlanta media. I'd known him for years by the time he was largely unknown to a broader audience. I mean, he'd go down as a candidate to some cities outside of Metro Atlanta, and there'd be a longer line to go see the local mayor than there would be to see him. Right? It was kind of a wake up call for him. He realized that, oh God, I got work to do. But what he said was that being with his parishioners, being with his congregants every Sunday, really gave him a deeper understanding of their needs and their wants and what he could do as a lawmaker to change that, more so than being a state representative or going through a more conventional route of being a lawyer or whatever to take it to the political realm. So that was really unique to me. And one other thing he did on the campaign trail to show you how important it was for him to maintain that connection was every Tuesday he took off on the campaign trail and would spend his days still dealing with congregant matters and, end of life calls, all the things that a pastor of a large congregation has to do. And he'd also work on a sermon, and it would take him 10 hours to work on a sermon, write it, research it, and practice it, and rehearse it, and do all the things that go into writing a sermon. So he'd spend a tremendous amount of time in between all his other duties of campaigning around the state, working on serving his role as a pastor of his flock.
Greg, I think we have time for one question.
Yes. Oh, Professor, I gotta end with her.
Always makes the effort to mentor our students in politics and journalism.
Thank you.
He's always like this. Always.
Thank you for your engagement. Thank you as well.
Well, I'm not going to top that. So, Greg, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who came out this afternoon. Really do appreciate it. I'll get out of your way and let you mingle
Thank you
amongst the
all for
folks.
coming. This makes me so happy.